A housekeeper stunned an entire banquet room man changed her life forever. Marta Alvarez never imagined that her simple life working in a suburban mansion would one day lead her to the center of a high-profile business dinner, where every glance felt like judgment. For the past 3 years, she had worked tirelessly for her employer Sebastian Granta, a well-known finance mogul, infamous for his cold demeanor and reclusive lifestyle following a messy divorce. To Marta, he was just a distant man, always buried in work, only speaking when something needed to be scrubbed more thoroughly. That afternoon, while Marta was wiping down the glass table in the library, Sebastian suddenly called her over. Without a greeting, he leaned against the doorframe, his face unreadable. "Tonight, I need someone to accompany me to an investor dinner," he said bluntly. "You won't need to speak. Just sit quietly and don't embarrass me." It was more of a command than an invitation and clearly a warning. Marta looked up, cloth still in hand. Something flickered in her chest, a strange mix of doubt and defiance. Despite the tone, something was shifting. She nodded slowly, then returned to her tiny room to prepare, not out of obedience, but because a part of her wanted to see if there was still a place for someone like her beyond mopping floors. That evening, Marta stepped out of Sebastian's car in front of an upscale restaurant in the city's financial district. She wore a modest but elegant turquoise dress, the only one she owned, a keepsake from her late mother. Her hair was neatly pinned up, and her gaze sharper than ever before. Sebastian stood nearby, dressed in a tailored black suit, glancing at his watch. He spared her only a brief glance before walking in. No compliments, no acknowledgement. They walked past a crowded row of tables to a private round table at the center of the room. Seated there were 6 older men, well-dressed, affluent investors with booming laughs and scrutinizing eyes. In a flat tone, Sebastian introduced her. "This is Marta. She's joining me tonight." No title, no role, as if she were a shadow. A few men nodded politely. One frowned. Dinner began in stiff silence. Conversation circled around profit margins, mergers, and global expansion. Marta sat quietly, carefully picking at her food, yet her eyes absorbed every word and every expression. She didn't have a college degree, but she was sharp-handed after years of cleaning Sebastian's office while he held conference calls. She had picked up more than anyone realized. Midway through the meal, a man named Mr. Grisana Venture, capital director, suddenly turned to her. "So, Ms. Marta," he said, with a tone that hinted at challenge, "what's your take on valuing companies based on simulated growth data?" The table fell silent. Sebastian shot her a warning glance, as if to will her into silence, but Marta didn't flinch. She met Mr. Grayson's gaze without hesitation. "I think," she began gently, "the real concern isn't the data itself, but when people trust it too blindly and forget that humans still drive everything. Data can predict trends, but if we ignore trust, ethics, and the true motivations behind the numbers, any strategy can collapse." A heavy silence hung over the table. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Grayson laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh. "You're absolutely right." That was a sharp observation. He nodded. The other men began to look at Marta differently, not with doubt, but with curiosity and a hint of respect. Sebastian didn't share their response. He turned his face away, clearly displeased. Marta had broken the mold he had placed her in. She wasn't the quiet, obedient woman he had assumed. As the evening ended, Marta shook hands with each man firmly. She didn't bow. She didn't apologize. And when she walked out of that restaurant, she no longer saw herself as just the maid. The next day, one of the investors sent a private message to Sebastian, saying they were impressed by the woman with the observant eyes and sharp intellect who accompanied you last night. Sebastian didn't reply. But when Marta entered his office to clean, he said quietly, "You changed everything." Marta said nothing. She simply smiled and returned to her work, but her posture was taller now, and the path ahead of her felt wider than ever before, unlike his usual reserved nature. Mr. Lewis found himself unexpectedly drawn to Evelyn's presence that evening. Unlike the familiar faces he'd seen at countless negotiations, Evelyn brought something different, a calm that wasn't rehearsed, a voice that wasn't calculated, and most of all, no fear. The conversation had followed the usual course: finance, strategy, profit, until Mr. Lewis shifted unexpectedly to a topic rarely heard at corporate dinner tables: social responsibility. Have you ever considered integrating community programs into the company's growth strategy? Mr. Lewis asked. His voice was calm, but his gaze was sharp, like a velvet-trapped arrow aimed straight at Richard. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. He hesitated for just a second, long enough for Evelyn to step into the silence with a voice that was steady, confident, and free of pretense. "I believe a business shouldn't exist solely for profit," she said slowly. "It must also recognize that it stands on the shoulders of an entire community. Social initiatives aren't a burden, they're a reflection of responsibility and gratitude." The room seemed to freeze. A few glasses clinked faintly, and the sound of cutlery ceased. Evelyn could feel every eye turn to her, but she didn't shrink away. If anything, the hush became her stage. Mr. Lewis chuckled softly, clearly impressed. "Miss Evelyn," he said, casting a mischievous glance at Richard, "is exactly the kind of person corporate boards should be listening to these days." Richard's expression tightened, his features hardening like stone. A tease was not what he had planned. He brought Evelyn along to soften his image, to play a quiet background role, not to become the center of attention. But now, she was the one everyone noticed. "That's easy for you to say," Richard said with a forced smile. "You're not the one carrying the weight of responsibility. Do you even understand what you're talking about, or are you just repeating what you've heard?" Evelyn didn't flinch. Her eyes met his not in defiance, but with quiet strength. "Maybe I've never sat at the decision-making table," she replied, "but I've lived close enough to feel the consequences of those decisions. And sometimes, the ones not at the top see what those above tend to miss." A long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, a soft round of applause came from an elderly investor seated at the end of the table. Silent nods began to ripple across the room. Evelyn, through sheer authenticity, had changed the entire atmosphere of the evening. Richard sat in silence, swallowing his rising frustration. Things had spiraled out of his control. He hadn't brought Evelyn here to be the name people remembered after the event. When the evening ended, he said nothing. No glance, no pause. He walked away ahead of her. Evelyn followed quietly behind, not bitter, not wounded. Inside her was a calm, grounded peace. She hadn't come to please anyone, she came to stand for what was right. And she had. What she didn't know, however, was that the real confrontation still lay ahead. The moment they returned to the villa, Evelyn had barely crossed the threshold when Richard's voice rang out from the study, cold and impatient. "Get in here, now." She stepped into the room, facing a storm of anger and barely concealed disappointment in his eyes. "What do you think you're doing, Evelyn?" he snapped. "I invited you to accompany me, not to showcase yourself like some board member or executive." Evelyn stood tall. "I answered a question. Nothing more. Nothing more." Richard scoffed. "You're the housekeeper, Evelyn, not a company representative. You crossed the line, and you know it." His words cut like salt into a wound, but Evelyn didn't respond with anger. She simply looked at him as one might look at a man limited by the narrowness of his own view. "To you, I might just be someone who cleans rooms. But that doesn't mean I don't have a voice or the right to speak the truth." Richard turned away, his shoulders tensing with restrained rage. Evelyn bowed her head, not out of submission, but out of respect for herself. She knew that when a man loses control just because a woman dares to speak up, the problem isn't the woman, it's his oversized ego, and she knew something else. 2. From that moment on, everything had changed. "May I ask you something?" she said softly but firmly, lifting her gaze. "If my presence bothers you so much, why did you bring me on this trip at all?" Richard didn't respond right away. He turned, poured himself a drink, then looked back at her, as cold as steel. "Seems like you've forgotten who signed your paycheck. Don't try to argue with logic. You're here to serve, not to challenge." A heavy silence fell. The wind from the balcony whispered through the sheer curtains, filling the room with a chill like a warning. Then, as if sealing a merciless contract, Richard said bluntly, "You should start packing. Consider today your last day. You're fired." The words dropped into the air like a blade, but Evelyn didn't flinch. No anger, no tears, just a slow, dignified nod. She stepped forward, quietly gathering the documents before looking up at Richard. One final look, devoid of hatred. Just the farewell of someone who had come to understand the limits of her self-respect. As Evelyn walked out of that dimly lit mansion, she didn't look back. She moved through the golden light of the quiet neighborhood street, her heart unburdened as if she had just broken free from a chain that had bound her for far too long. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The next morning, while Evelyn was sorting through old photos and notebooks where she had once sketched out early ideas, the phone rang, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Is this Evelyn?" came a warm, deep male voice. "Kay, this is Jonathan Lewis. I happened to overhear what you said at the party last night, Kay, and I have to say, I was impressed." Her heart skipped. Jonathan Lewis, one of the most respected investors in regenerative tech, was calling her. "I'm building a new strategic team. I'd like to invite you to be part of it, not as an assistant, in a role that fits your vision." Evelyn could hardly believe what she was hearing. And yet, her voice came out, calm, steady. "It would be an honor. I'm ready." What followed in the next few weeks felt like stepping into a different universe. No more condescending stares, no more cold commands. She was heard. Ideas once dismissed as too bold were now central to high-stakes initiatives. Under Mr. Lewis's mentorship, Kaylin uncovered a side of herself she had long doubted: natural leadership, sharp strategic thinking, and a calm decisiveness. Under pressure, colleagues began turning to her during tense meetings, seeking her judgment as an anchor. Meanwhile, Richard's old company fell into crisis. Complacency and short-sighted decisions led to an investor exodus. Seasoned executives resigned. The media began to speak of the man who once had everything, was cool, and lost it all because he refused to listen to anyone but himself. Then came the turning point. 3 months later, Mr. Lewis's firm, where Evelyn now held the title of strategic director, announced plans to acquire a 40% stake to rescue a portion of Richard's collapsing enterprise. Evelyn was appointed as the lead negotiator for the merger talks. When Richard entered the conference room, his eyes froze. Evelyn sat confidently at the head of the table, her deep blue blazer crisp, her hair swept up neatly, and her calm gaze meeting his stunned expression without flinching. He stammered, "Evelyn, what is this?" She rose and extended a professional handshake, her tone composed and neutral. "Good morning. Today, we're here to discuss the future." Richard forced a smile, twisted and uneasy. "I didn't expect you to take the opposing side." She replied slowly, "I'm not on any side. I stand with values where actions define worth, not power." His jaw clenched, but he couldn't argue. The room fell silent. Evelyn closed her statement with calm precision. "I was once someone you overlooked. Today, I'm part of the decision that may save your company, or not." Light from the tall windows angled into the room, casting a glow across her face, not like someone who had once been discarded, but like someone who had risen from the ashes, unshakable and whole, still reading. Comment: self-respect, if you believe that dignity and quiet determination will always lead us home. Later, Richard stormed into the office, his face tense, his eyes sharp as glass, as he stopped right in front of Evelyn. The space between them was barely a breath, yet she held her ground. "Don't fool yourself into thinking this makes you important," he hissed, his voice tight and bitter. "You're just a lucky woman who stumbled into a place she doesn't belong." Evelyn lifted her chin, arms calmly crossed, unmoved. "It's not luck, Richard. It's efforts, something you've never truly understood. And because you never valued anything beyond your own reflection, that's exactly why you lost everything." Richard stood, frozen, without a word left to fight back. For a brief moment, in her gaze, he saw a mirror, one that showed him a man who had lost his way, yet still refused to accept it. "I don't need anyone by my side to validate my worth," he said, clinging to the last traces of authority in his voice. "This company, it's still mine, and you won't change that." Evelyn didn't smile, but there was a quiet, unshakable calm in her eyes. "Then prove it, Richard. Show us you have the courage to fix the wreckage you created." Plus, who think they're invincible are often the ones who fall the fastest. She turned and walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in a silence that echoed like a verdict. Evelyn's words hadn't been an insult. They were a quiet sentence passed down. And for the first time, Richard felt something gnawing at his chest, fear not of a stronger opponent, but of losing everything because of his own arrogance and blindness. That night, Richard didn't open his laptop. No spreadsheets, no strategy drafts. Instead, he sat alone in his office, the warm desk lamp casting shadows across his somber face. Every misstep, every moment he dismissed someone's voice, every argument he'd won by sheer force now turned against him like knives cutting through his hollow pride. He thought about the loyal employees he had once pushed away, the trusted advisors he'd shut out simply because they had dared to disagree. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't trust himself. 3 days later, in a boardroom on the 15th floor, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows. As Richard and Evelyn sat across from a panel of strategic investors, the air felt dense, like it could be sliced. The chairman, an older man with stark white hair and eyes sharp as glass, spoke first, cutting straight to the point. "Richard, we need to see real clarity and change. There's no room left for outdated plans or short-sighted leadership. This is your last chance to prove you still belong in charge." Richard gave a slight nod and began his presentation. His voice was steady but mechanical. He spoke of market trends, profit margins, restructuring costs, but his words lacked soul. The numbers he cited fell flat, offering no vision, no conviction. Only the hollow echo of a man clinging to a role he no longer understood. Silence followed. Then Evelyn stood, decked. No thick binders, no elaborate decks, just a pen and a simple graph on the screen. "I'm not here to fight for control," she said. "I'm here to say we can do this differently. Not just restore profit, but restore purpose. Bring back the human value, social responsibility, and reputation this company once stood for." She spoke about community initiatives, about making people, not just profit, the center of every business decision. She offered real examples, successful models, and numbers backed by human-first policies. Faces in the room began to shift. Few nods. The chairman leaned forward, asking her to continue. And when she spoke, it wasn't with the confidence of someone who wanted to win, it was with the steady belief of someone who had a long-term vision worth following. Richard sat quietly beside her. Every word she said peeled back a layer of illusion he had wrapped around himself. And slowly he understood It wasn't him who could pull the company back from the edge. It was her. The meeting ended without applause, without announcements. But the message was clear. The balance of power had shifted, and it didn't rest with Richard anymore. On the drive back, Richard said nothing. For the first time in years, he realized he needed to relearn how to listen. Evelyn was no longer the assistant she used to be. She was the one who had risen beyond him with clarity, courage, curing, and conviction that needed no title. He gazed out the window, watching skyscrapers slide by like fading memories. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild. But this time, couldn't do it alone. Back at headquarters, as the heavy door to the boardroom clicked shut behind him, Richard walked slowly down the corridor, the fluorescent ceiling lights casting a cold, white glow on the floor. He paused by a glass wall, one hand resting on the frame without realizing. A familiar voice spoke behind him. "Are you searching for answers, or running from them?" Evelyn asked softly. She didn't turn, but she knew he was listening. He hesitated, then answered, voice rough, heavy. "Why are you still helping me? After everything I've done?" Evelyn turned toward him. Cots met his not with anger, not with judgment, only a strange, steady calm. "Because I believe people can change if they truly want to." "I'm not helping you, Richard. I'm helping everyone who still believes in what this company could be, even if they've lost faith in the man who once led it." Those words struck straight into his corn, like a weapon meant to wound, but like a sharp blade that left a mark he'd never forget. For the first time, Richard didn't feel attacked, felt more like being illuminated by a truth he had long avoided. Evelyn turned and walked toward the elevator, left alone in the empty hallway. Richard felt hollow, diminished. The woman he had once overlooked had now become the mirror reflecting everything he lacked. That evening, he returned home early, opened his laptop, but didn't work. Instead, he reread old reports, not to find mistakes, but to understand where he had gone wrong. Every page was like facing a former version of himself, and in the background of his mind, Evelyn's image kept replaying like a haunting refrain, calm, unwavering, and unwilling to bow. By Monday morning, the investment board had called a special meeting. Richard knew this was a pivotal moment. The company's budget remained unstable, and a single misstep could unravel everything they'd worked for. He spent the entire weekend preparing not to prove he was right, but because he genuinely wanted to see the company survive the storm. Meanwhile, Evelyn carried on as usual, quietly, professionally preparing her presentation. No theatrics, no slogans. She believed sustainability came from a solid foundation, not risky leaps. The meeting began at 9 a.m. Evelyn presented first, methodically laying out her plan, step by step, emphasizing system stability, risk mitigation, and rebuilding investor confidence. The board members listened intently, nodding with growing approval. When she finished, Richard rose. He straightened his tie, then walked to the presentation screen. "I'd like to offer a different perspective," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "Evelyn makes a strong case. She's right in many points, okay? But if we only take slow steps to avoid falling, we'll get left behind. I believe it's time we show we're not afraid to move faster, as long as we're moving toward a clear goal." Evelyn looked at him silently. She didn't interrupt. "We need attention. We need momentum. The market isn't waiting, it's watching. And if we don't make our mark, even the most stable plan can become invisible." The room tightened. Some board members nodded slightly. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Evelyn then rose and stepped beside him. Her voice was soft, but carried through the room. "Richard, you speak of making a mark. I speak of lasting presence. We're leading hundreds of people who don't need a flash of brilliance. They need survival. We can't go down the same path that nearly wrecked this company, just to prove a point. A long silence followed. Every board member was locked in the exchange, reading between the lines, measuring each word. Finally, Chairman Haynes spoke. I suggested the two of you sit down and create a combined proposal, something that holds Evelyn's stability and, if possible, Richard's push for innovation. We don't need to pick sides. We need to choose what's right. After the meeting, Richard passed Evelyn's office. He stopped, but didn't knock. This time, instead of walking away, he nodded down unspoken acknowledgement. Evelyn didn't say a word, but she offered a faint, knowing smile. For the first time, they weren't arguing. They were listening. Richard sat alone in the now empty boardroom. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, a quiet reminder that time was moving and he was slowly falling behind. Evelyn had left barely 10 minutes ago, but in that short window, everything Richard once thought he controlled suddenly felt out of reach. No longer the founder in charge, no longer the one being heard. He felt like an outsider in the very company he had sacrificed his youth to build. That night, instead of going home, Richard stayed at the office. He sat alone, staring at the glowing laptop screen filled with cold financial figures. He combed through balance sheets and budget plans as though hunting for some hidden clue that he still mattered, some solution no one had seen. The ideas still came, as they always did, but every path seemed too expensive or too risky to pursue alone. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Adrian Kelleran, old business associate he hadn't heard from in years, made him pause. I heard the company's in trouble. I might have a way to help. Short and to the point. But it hit exactly where Richard was most vulnerable, his need to prove himself and his fear of being forgotten. The next day, Richard sat in a high-end cafe across from Mr. Kelleran, a well-known investor who presented an offer, a large capital infusion in exchange for advisory access on community impact projects. I don't want control, Keller said. I just want a voice at the table. To Richard, it sounded like the perfect deal. He nodded, and just a few hours later, without informing the leadership team, he signed a preliminary agreement. The confrontation beneath fluorescent lights. That moment, Richard felt as if he had just pulled himself out of a riptide. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was leading again, like he was in control, proving he didn't have to bow his head just to keep a seat in the room he once helped open. But that sense of victory was fleeting when Evelyn walked into the office and saw the contract lying on the desk. Her face froze. No explanation was needed. She simply stood there, her gaze not loud with anger, but heavy with quiet disappointment. Richard was in the middle of a video call with Mr. Keller, enthusiastically discussing the next phase of development. But the moment he saw Evelyn, his hand stopped over the mouse. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like ice. You signed an agreement without board approval. Richard stood, trying to remain calm. We needed funding, Evelyn. This was the only way forward. You know that. She stepped closer, eyes boring into him. And you thought hiding it was the right move. Do you not see the risk? What happens when he starts making suggestions for his own gain? Who's going to stop him then? He's just offering input. He doesn't have any decision-making power. Evelyn gave a cold smile. Do you even remember what we promised each other when this all began? Transparency. People first. Ambition-driven shortcuts. And what about you? Richard snapped back. You're always standing there, judging me. If you've ever once tried to put yourself in my position. She didn't get angry. Her voice was soft but firm. I don't need to be in your place to understand what leadership should look like. I just need to see integrity in your actions. And Richard, you haven't shown me that. He turned away, not wanting her to see his eyes beginning to well up. Maybe you're right, he murmured. But you never gave me a real chance to make things right. No one's stopping you from making things right, she replied. Huh, but doing that by secretly signing deals behind everyone's back? That's not it. The silence between them grew heavy. Evelyn left without another word. The soft click of the door closing behind her left a chill in the air. 2 weeks later, the boardroom reckoning. 2 weeks later, the main conference room, filled with the members of the board gathered to review the contract Richard had signed. There were no more justifications. This time, he had to face the consequences, and the only question echoing in his mind was whether he had lost something far more valuable than control-trust. From the moment Richard entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Subtle glances, highlighted pages of documents, restrained gestures all spoke one thing: disapproval. No one had to say it aloud. He knew a storm was coming. Evelyn was the first to break the silence, her voice calm but firm. She pushed a packet of documents across the table, eyes fixed on him. This isn't just a financial contract. It's a redefinition of the principles we once held sacred. An investor who doesn't share our values is being allowed into the heart of our project. Do you realize what that means? Across the table, Mr. Hanks, the oldest member of the board, leaned forward slightly. We want to hear it directly from you. Why did you make this decision without any prior discussion? Richard took a deep breath. His throat was dry as he struggled to keep his voice steady. We need new capital to scale. I considered the risks, and I believe this choice ensures long-term sustainability for the organization. His defense was cut short. Sustainability. The board chair raised an eyebrow. Are we talking financial sustainability or the soul of this organization? We don't need a CEO who's just quick with investments. We need someone who listens. Richard didn't know how to respond. He looked at Evelyn, but she turned away. In that moment, he didn't just lose ground, he lost their trust. When the meeting ended, the board announced they would reevaluate his leadership role. A formal vote was scheduled for the following week. Till then, Richard's authority over major decisions would be temporarily suspended. He left the room in silence, the sound of his shoes echoing down the long hallway like a warning bell for a downfall he hadn't yet dared to face. The Forgotten Faces apartment Richard lived in had once been a symbol of achievement. Floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furnishings, a warm golden glow from designer lights. But tonight, no amount of lighting could ease the emptiness inside him. He stood motionless before the mirror above the dining table where Evelyn once sat, listening to his bold ideas. Now, it was nothing but a memory fading with time. Wasn't them? He thought silently. I made this all too hard to believe in. Richard used to believe that financial strategy was the answer to every problem, but now, the consequences of those rushed decisions were becoming painfully clear. He was no longer a trusted guide, but a man isolated within his own vision. Dawn of an awakening. The next morning, a soft rain fell. Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual, not for work, but because he needed to face himself. He didn't turn on the lights, letting only the dim gray light from the window fall over the piles of files that now seemed to pass silent. Judgment on him. He sat down and began flipping through meeting minutes, personal notes, and a handwritten letter from a former colleague who had resigned the year before, stating, I just don't feel like this organization is a place I can serve anymore. Evelyn's words from the previous day echoed clearly. In his mind, you're turning this organization into a money-making machine, but this is a place for people, not spreadsheets. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time, he dared to ask himself a deeper question. Am I really leading, or just managing? He had never truly listened. He was used to making decisions, used to leading with numbers, logic, and tactics. But those around him, Evelyn, the board, the staff, they wanted something different. Empathy, recognition, participation, the seed of a new kind of leadership. The office was empty, but inside Richard, there was no longer a hollow silence. He had begun to hear, to see. not through data or performance reviews, but through the quiet unraveling within his own heart. Leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about having the courage to look back and say, I was wrong. Richard picked up a pen and notebook. For the first time, what he wrote wasn't a financial plan, but a personal commitment. I will relearn how to lead, starting by listening to each person, each story. And Evelyn, if you're still willing, please show me the way. The rain still whispered outside, but within the quiet room, something had begun to take root. Dusk of a confession, the last light of day, spilled through the office window, bathing the room in the gentle orange hues of sunset. Richard sat quietly at his desk, slowly turning an old fountain pen between his fingers. When the door opened, Evelyn stood there, not distant as before. God, still unreadable, like the surface of a still lake. Were you expecting me? She asked, not coldly, not accusingly. Richard stood up slowly, his voice rough from too many sleepless nights. I don't know what brought you here, but I do know there's something I can't avoid any longer, okay? Evelyn set her bag down on the chair across from him. She gave a small nod, as if giving him permission to go on. Evelyn, he began, I've been arrogant. I believed I was always right, that power meant control, that I couldn't afford to appear weak. But more and more, I've come to realize I've missed something really important. She sat down, hands clasped in her lap. Her expression wasn't angry, was patiently cautious. And what do you think changed you? She asked. He looked at her, the honesty in his eyes tinged with fear. Maybe it was when I realized, no one trusted me anymore, not even myself. Evelyn let out a slow breath. So, what now? Regret isn't the end, Richard. It's only the beginning. Are you ready to act? Richard nodded slowly, deliberately. I don't want to play the commander anymore. I want to learn how to walk alongside, but I need someone to guide me. Her expression softened. Real leadership doesn't mean knowing everything. It means knowing when to listen and having the courage to change when it matters. In the days that followed, instead of showing up in glass conference rooms, Richard began volunteering with a program the company sponsored, one he had never paid much attention to before. It was a vocational training initiative for women who had survived domestic violence. Evelyn had been the one to propose it. On his first morning, he wore a simple shirt, left his luxury car in the farthest parking lot, Tia, and walked into the community center on foot. There were no speeches, no slides, just the sound of children playing, the scent of brewed coffee, and faces lined with quiet resilience. During one of the group sessions, Richard sat among the women, learning baking, electrical, repair, and microfinance skills. He remained silent the whole time, jotting down only a short note. Her voice trembled, telling her story, but her eyes never looked down. Maybe this is a kind of strength I've never known before. During the break, a woman with salt and pepper hair approached him. She didn't make small talk, nor did she smile out of politeness. You're Mr. Blake, aren't you? She asked, her gaze fixed on him. Yes, I'm Richard Blake, he replied, a bit cautiously. She didn't respond right away. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of something she had rehearsed many times. My son used to work in your department. He was let go without warning. He used to admire you and defended you when others criticized your decisions. But after that day, he stopped believing in anyone. Now, he does. Manual labor keeps to himself and won't even accept something as simple as a compliment. Richard stood, frozen. I had no idea. I'm truly sorry. She tilted her head slightly, looking straight into his eyes. Maybe you don't remember, but sometimes not caring is still a choice, and choices have consequences. Nodded, his eyes welling up as the truth struck him, a truth he had never faced before. That indifference can be just as destructive as any mistake. Before walking away, she said something he would never forget. The world doesn't need perfect leaders. It needs people who truly listen when others are hurting. That evening, Richard sat alone in his old office. He didn't turn on the computer, didn't check his emails. He simply pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket and began to write. Day 1, I realized I know nothing about the people around me, and that's why I was wrong. He stood silently before the tall window in his office, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the neutral-colored carpet. Gone was the usual sense of self-assuredness. In its place was a heavy stillness, as though a thick curtain had been pulled back to reveal a truth he'd long avoided. Evelyn's words from that morning weren't just observations. They were a mirror, reflecting the parts of himself he had never dared to confront, the pain he had caused, without even realizing it. For the first time, Richard questioned whether the image he had so carefully built of a sharp, competent executive was still worth holding on to. Maybe Evelyn had been right all along. Maybe he was just a man who looked good on paper, but had failed to understand the true value of the people around him. That same afternoon, as the air still hung heavy with reflection, Richard knocked on Evelyn's office door. He brought no papers, no agenda, just a quiet intention to say thank you. Thank you for this morning, he said, his voice low and sincere. It was the first time I truly saw what I've been avoiding. Evelyn gave a slight nod. Her eyes held no suspicion now, no guardedness, only the clear resolve of a woman who had heard far too many empty promises. Awareness is a first step, she replied. Real change takes more than that. You'll need to prove it with action and time. In the days that followed, Richard didn't retreat to his usual executive chair. Instead, Evelyn invited him to join a planning session with the community project team, a space he rarely stepped into unless there was a PR opportunity or financial gain to be made. The meeting room wasn't large, but the tension inside was thick. Every eye turned toward Richard, some skeptical, others cautiously polite. Each step he took felt like walking on glass. Though Evelyn motioned for him to begin, Richard shook his head. This time, he understood the power of staying quiet and just listening, one by one. The team voiced their concerns: delayed timelines, budget shortfalls, broken internal communication. Marka young, passionate team members spoke calmly but firmly, saying they were losing sight of the core mission. We can't keep treating this like a pilot program or a temporary project, Mark said. We're working with real people's lives. That requires patience, not decisions made to look good on a report. Richard took in every word like notes carved into his conscience. Decisions he had once called strategic now appeared cold and, sometimes, heartless. A few days later, Richard asked Evelyn if he could accompany the field team to visit one of the communities they were supporting. Not as a supervisor, but as a learner. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded. That visit brought them to a vocational training center, where Richard met Julia, a young single mother who had once struggled to survive before joining the program. She told her story with a quiet glow in her eyes, saying that, thanks to the project, she now had stable work and could provide for her little girl. This isn't just a course, Key said, clutching her textbook tightly. It's the beginning of a life I never thought I could have. Richard remained silent on the drive home. His eyes stared at the window, but his mind was spinning with images of Julia, of Mark, and of the faces in that meeting room. He began to realize that leadership wasn't about control or issuing commands. It was about listening, about setting aside ego to protect something greater, people. The next day, he returned to Evelyn's office. No hesitation, no prepared speech. Standing tall before her, Richard spoke. I used to see this project as a ticket to rebuild my image, to reclaim my name. But now I know that was an illusion. What I saw yesterday changed me. I don't want to be the man I was. Evelyn remained silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on his face. Then she asked quietly, "So, what will you choose this time? To begin again?" Richard took a deep breath, as if accepting a journey where he was no longer holding the reins. "By serving," he said, "and by not forgetting Julia's story." He had changed, but not overnight. Later, Richard sat alone by his office window, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across his desk. His voice was low, measured, as if admitting something for the very first time. "I was so used to being in control, but now I just want to understand. I want to build something that lasts, not just with strategy, but with trust. Not for me, but for the people living this project every day." A Linda woman who had once doubted his every move didn't respond right away, but her gaze had softened. "If you're serious, then prove it, step by step, word by word, action by action. We don't need promises, we need a partner." After that conversation, something unexpected happened. Richard didn't disappear like before. He came back regularly, not in a tailored suit or with an air of superiority, but carrying a notebook and an unusual sense of humility. He sat through team briefings without interrupting. He asked for input from even the most junior staff and sometimes gave them the floor during major meetings. At first, the small changes confused people, but slowly they started to notice Richard was no longer the cold man who cared only about profit margins. Instead, Key arrived earlier than the operations manager. He observed training sessions, dropped by the break room, and listened, truly listened to even the smallest complaints. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew this man was changing. Evelyn saw it too, but she didn't applaud just yet. She'd seen too many people change for a moment, only to fall back into old ways. She waited to see, was he truly committed? The answer came on a drizzly morning when Richard showed up at a community training session not announced and off schedule. He didn't come to speak or give orders. He sat quietly in the back, listening to a woman named Anna share her story, on nearly 50. Once a factory worker spoke about the pain of unemployment and shame. She talked about the winter night when she couldn't bring herself to tell her son they only had dry bread left. "This place," she said, glancing around the room, "gave me the chance to feel human again." Then she turned to Richard, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you'll remember me, but because of the changes you've made, I feel like I matter again." Richard said nothing. He just lowered his head, his eyes red. No longer a CEO, no longer an investor, a human being. In the days that followed, he became a regular presence in community support programs, but never took the stage. He memorized everyone's names, asked about their families, and approved policy updates to make sure every small voice was heard. One board member whispered, "I never thought I'd see him wiping tables with the staff. But yesterday, I saw it with my own eyes." His commitment became clearer every day, not through speeches, but through quiet action. He wasn't doing it to prove a point. He did it because, for the first time, he understood something money could never buy: trust. By the end of the month, Evelyn once again walked past his office. The door was open. Richard was sitting with a group of young staff, explaining budget management, but with a gentler tone than ever before. When he saw her, he stood and walked over. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "thank you for your patience. I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but I am walking step by step toward becoming the man I should have been a long time ago." She nodded silently. There were no words, but in her eyes there was recognition. Not because he had completely changed, but because he had finally chosen the right path. From that day forward, Richard was no longer just the one in charge. Became part of the team. And that's far more than authority. It was what made people begin to trust him. What was once just a project outlined on charts and proposals began to take real form. Early results didn't just bring tangible improvements to the community. They also slowly changed how the senior leadership viewed things. The company's voice gained credibility, and Richard, once associated with aloofness and control, was now seen in a warmer, more genuine light by his colleagues. During each presentation, Richard no longer spoke endlessly about personal achievements. He chose his words carefully, sharing successes with humility. Every accomplishment was credited to the team, and he never failed to highlight Evelyn's role, the one who had contributed quietly it more than anyone else. Data and statistics were no longer dry numbers. They became living proof of the project's impact. The board began to show signs of trust in their eyes and in their tone. At a special meeting, Mr. Haynes, known for his strict standard, spoke up frankly. "Richard, your dedication is impressive. I didn't expect this, but I'm glad to see it. If the project continues with this spirit, I believe we can leave behind a meaningful legacy." Richard only nodded lightly, but inside, those words rang like a bell, marking a true turning point. He knew he wouldn't have come this far without Evelyn by his side. The time they spent working together didn't just help the project flourish, also deepened the connection between them. Evelyn wasn't the type to talk much or seek attention, but the way she showed up, the way she listened, her gentle encouragement, her precision with details taught Richard that professionalism didn't have to be cold or distant. One Saturday afternoon, they attended a small community gathering organized by local residents to thank the project team. It was a simple event held in a breezy courtyard where the people who had benefited most from the project shared their stories. Richard stood still, watching as Evelyn sat on the ground, hand in hand with an elderly woman, talking as if they'd known each other forever. There was no line between coordinator and beneficiary, only pure empathy. In that moment, something stirred inside Richard. Evelyn wasn't just competent, she had something deeper, a quiet strength, a grounded faith in the value of helping others. On the way back, calm, rain-washed air felt almost sacred. Richard turned to her, compelled by a need to understand the woman beside him more fully. "Evelyn," he said hesitantly, "I've always wondered, what brought you to this kind of work? Not everyone can give themselves to it the way you do." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes soft with both kindness and memory. "I suppose it's because I've known what it feels like to be left behind. My family didn't have much growing up. I saw people I loved get hurt because there was no one there to help. So when I got older, I thought, maybe if I could be the one to reach out first, someone else wouldn't have to go through it alone the way I did." Her words struck something deep in Richard, a part of himself he'd ignored for too long. He had once seen the project only as a way to prove his worth, to reclaim his reputation. But Evelyn showed him another way to see it. Work could be a mission, a way to heal yourself by healing others. In the weeks that followed, their collaboration became more effortless than ever. Meetings no longer felt like obligations, but opportunities, moments to share ideas, to listen, to learn from one another. Richard began to shift. Instead of making decisions alone, he sought out input. Instead of keeping his distance, he let connection in DAT. And then, one evening, while reviewing a report with Evelyn in the office, he looked up at her not as a colleague, not just as an advisor. His feelings had moved beyond admiration. What he felt was something deeper, something real. He didn't say a word, but in that glance, Richard knew he was on a new journey, not just the journey of leading a project, but the journey of becoming a better man, alongside a woman he never expected would change the way he saw the world. From the first time they worked together, Richard had sensed that Evelyn was unlike anyone he'd met in his professional life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek recognition, but her calm, steady presence earned the team's respect. Whenever she spoke, the room seemed to quiet, not because she was loud, but because she was honest. One late evening, when The only lights still on in the office were on their floor. Richard and Evelyn sat together reviewing the long-term development plan for the project. At first, their conversations centered around goals, budgets, and timelines. But as the coffee turned cold and the office grew quiet around them, the discussion gradually shifted to more personal matters: trust, and how each of them defined success. Richard hesitated, his eyes fixed on his hands as he slowly twirled a pen between his fingers. Without looking at her, he finally spoke. "Evelyn, I don't think you realize how much you've influenced me. I used to think being a leader meant always being in control, but now I get it. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is step back and let others shine." She looked at him, a soft flicker of surprise lighting up her eyes. "To be honest," she replied gently, "watching the way you've changed has made this job more meaningful to me than it's ever been." In that moment, the air seemed too still around them. Richard felt something stir deep within, not the kind of feeling you have for just a colleague. It was something more profound, more quietly alive. But he didn't rush it. Instead, he simply smiled, gave a small nod, and let the silence between them speak without breaking it with unnecessary words. In the days that followed, Richard found himself drawn to Evelyn in a way he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't infatuation. It was a quiet comfort, a sense of ease whenever she was near. He began noticing the little things, the way her brows furrowed when she was focused, the brief smile she gave when a team member did something right, and how she always put the team before herself. One Friday evening, after most of the office lights had gone dark, they stayed late again, making final tweaks to the presentation. As they were about to leave, Richard turned to her and blurted out, "You're the most genuine person I've ever met." Evelyn paused for a beat, then smiled softly. "You've changed too, and I believe it's real." Her words touched something tender in him, a place he hadn't visited in a long time. It wasn't a fleeting crush. It was admiration, deep and sincere, yearning to walk alongside someone who both understood him and challenged him to be better. In the weeks that followed, people on the team began to notice something different between them. No lines had been crossed, but their glances, their subtle attentiveness to one another, and the way they gravitated toward each other after hours told a quiet story. Evelyn, who had always prioritized her career, felt something in Richard's presence awaken a part of her she'd long kept locked away. They started sharing more outside of work-wide fears, past losses, and personal truths they hadn't told anyone else. One evening, during a walk after work, Richard opened up about his strict father and the constant pressure to prove himself. Evelyn didn't say much, just walked beside him, silent. But that silence felt more present, more listening than any words ever had. That night, as they sat together in a small meeting room finalizing a report, the soft light from the desk lamp fell across Evelyn's face in a way that made time seem to pause. Their hands rested close on the table, not touching, but the tiny space between them held a whole unspoken universe. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said quietly. "It's not just for the work, but for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." She met his eyes, steady and unwavering. This time, it was she who gently placed a hand over his. No declarations of love were spoken, but they both knew some boundary between professionalism and something deeper had quietly dissolved, poned, not out of weakness, but because of the honesty between two souls who had found one another amidst the noise, and whatever their future held. They both understood that from that moment forward, life had turned a page. They were no longer the same people, no longer alone in their separate journeys, but two hearts facing the same direction with a kind of trust that didn't need to be named. Evelyn froze for a moment as she recognized the rare sincerity in Richard's eyes. He was no longer just a man of logic and strategy. He was someone laying his heart bare. "You don't need to thank me, Richard," she said. her voice gentle but firm. "The path you're walking, now that's your choice." I just held up the map. Richard smiled, a smile full of both gratitude and hesitance. Inside him swirled a storm of emotions he'd held back for far too long. He knew that if he didn't speak now, he might regret it forever. "Evelyn," he said, voice rough with vulnerability, "I've tried to stay silent, but I can't anymore. Every day, every moment we spend together, I feel it so clearly. I love you." The room felt still. His words fell like snowflakes in spring expected, delicate, yet heavy with meaning. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She looked at him, her gaze deep and searching, peeling back layers of emotion long hidden. Finally, she exhaled. "I feel the same, Richard. I've known it for a while. But I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it might ruin what we've built together. I was scared to lose the connection we worked so hard to create." Richard let out a soft chuckle, mix of emotion and relief. "I used to be afraid to," he admitted, "but that fear no longer outweighs what I feel right now. I want to be with you not just as a partner, but as a companion in every sense of the word." Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes glowing, though still tinged with hesitation. "Think we're strong enough to protect both our work and what's between us, and I believe it's time for something real." They slowly leaned into each other. When their lips finally met, there were no fireworks, no swelling music, just a quiet tenderness that felt achingly true. In that moment, two souls became one, no longer divided by duty or affection, only bound by trust. In the days that followed, their relationship quietly blossomed. Without fanfare or declarations, Evelyn and Richard began to carve out time for just the two of them, candlelit dinners, long evening walks through the public garden, conversations that drifted nowhere, yet somehow meant everything. Out work, they remained impeccably professional. The project flourished, drawing in new investors and community interest. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone sensed something had shifted. In invisible warmth surrounded them, lifting the entire team. Richard was no longer the authoritarian leader he once was. He listened, he learned, and he led with an open heart. The results were undeniable. Participants in the program started finding stable jobs, developing new skills, and slowly rebuilding their lives. The board, once skeptical, now stood firmly behind him. In a formal meeting, Mr. Haynes, the most hard-nosed of them all, rose to his feet and nodded toward Richard. "You've shown us that real change is possible," he said. "This project isn't just a success, it's an inspiration. Tia, proud to work alongside you, Richard." Richard accepted the praise with humility, but his eyes soon drifted to Evelyn, as if to say she had been his guiding light all along. Outside the office, they continued nurturing their connection in quiet, meaningful ways. No grand gestures, no pretense, just two people learning to love each other right. Cherishing the small things, the way Evelyn brewed his tea every morning, or the little notes Richard left for her before each meeting. One Sunday afternoon, as the golden light of dusk bathed the park in a soft calm, Richard gently squeezed Evelyn's hand. They were sitting on an old wooden bench, watching ducks glide across the pond in silence. He turned to her, his eyes alight. "You know, lately I keep dreaming about a small house with a garden, your voice singing from the kitchen, and an old dog asleep under the table. In that dream, you're the woman I call my wife." Evelyn looked at him, startled, her lips trembling as if the words hadn't yet fully landed. Richard smiled softly and placed a hand on her cheek. "Don't answer now," he said. "Just know this: if the day ever comes when you're ready, I'll be waiting at the end of that road, with an open heart and a love without conditions." Evelyn said nothing. She rested her head gently on his shoulder, letting the breeze comb through her hair, carrying with it an unspoken promise, quiet hope for a future they would both wait for. I don't think I ever imagined that someone like you could change the way I see the world, Richard whispered as they stood beneath the old oak in the park. His voice no longer carried the urgency of a man chasing results, but the calm of someone who had learned to slow down. Evelyn, you've taught me that success isn't about winning, it's about how we walk alongside others. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes glistening in the fading sunlight. And I never expected to meet a Richard like this. The man I met at first wasn't someone I could trust. But the man standing in front of me now is the one I choose to walk with. He didn't say a word, just took her hand gently in his, amid the soft rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children. They stood together as if the world had paused to give them space for a new beginning. The months that followed marked a profound transformation, not only for Richard, but for the entire project they had built together. No longer just a company chasing numbers and profit, they began implementing policies that made a real impact, supporting low-income families, creating opportunities for those long forgotten by society. Richard was no longer the man barking orders. He became the learner, the connector, the quiet supporter. Evelyn, with her innate strength and kindness, emerged as the soul of the organization. They were often invited to speak at major conferences, not just about leadership, but about how a company could lead with heart and still thrive. People didn't see them as CEO and director. They were living proof that love and professional integrity could not only coexist, but transform everything they touched. Nonprofits began to partner with their company. Major newspapers covered their human-centered initiatives. But when asked what made him most proud, Richard simply smiled. It's in the eyes of a child who knows there will be a warm meal tomorrow. It's in the smile of a mother who just found out her child received a scholarship from our foundation. And Evelyn said, success isn't measured by how much money we make. It's measured by how much hope we can reignite in those who had lost it. One spring afternoon, in the small garden behind their headquarters once, an old parking lot they had transformed into a green space for staff and the community, they held a simple wedding ceremony. No glamour, no grand stage. Wild daisies, wooden chairs, and heartfelt hugs from the people they had once helped as they read their vows. Evelyn said, "You're not just the man I love. You're the one I trust to do the right thing, especially when no one's watching." Okay. And Richard replied, "You're the reason I became the best version of myself. Okay. And I promise from this day forward, every choice I make will carry a part of us in it." That night, under a sky full of stars and the soft golden glow from the porch lights, they danced slowly. No city noise, no deadlines, just two hearts beating in perfect rhythm. Richard came to understand. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to recognize what truly matters. He had found it not in numbers or success, but in the gentle grasp of the woman standing beside him. From that day on, they didn't just live for themselves. They lived to build something greater than what two people alone could ever achieve. A legacy not measured by fame, but by every dream they helped awaken in someone else. Do you believe people can truly change, not just for themselves, but for the ones they love? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10 and if it touched your heart. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more inspiring journeys.